Good morning. We are at the second day of the Big Learning Event, and today we're really going to have a series of rap sessions, if you will, with our distinguished guests. I just want to acknowledge that this is the chance for Kathy and I to kind of live out a little dream that we have. I get to be the Black Donahue, and she gets to be the White Oprah. So let me give you the lay of the land, how things are going to work for us this morning. Yes. I need a mic, right? My Donahue moment. So let me tell you what's happening. No. But we're really here today to take advantage of the wisdom, and we want to hear from you all to get a sense of what's on your mind today. I think in the packet that you all received were response papers. I just wanted to take this time to let you know or ask you if you would be so kind as to check your cell phones and make sure that they're turned off or on vibrate or silent for us. And yeah, I think that's it. Kathy, you want to set us up for what's going to happen for this next segment?
Sure. Welcome back, everybody. So the first part of today, this morning, is going to be a dialogue with the 6 fascinating people up here, as well as you all. We've taken account of some of the themes that emerged yesterday, and while we're talking, we'll be taking account of other themes that emerged from this morning and thoughts that you send back while we're having a discussion up here. So I guess what we'd like to do is just to acknowledge that yesterday, each of you shared with us 3 ideas that were very important for you and that you've been spending time.
Just interject 1 second.
Yeah.
I do know we're taping, so for the sake of the taping, if we could just quickly run down the line, we can say folks' names so they know who you are for those who are watching today's event as a separate entity.
Great point. Yeah, Meg, would you like to start?
Meg Wheatley.
Nathan Wolf.
Richie Davidson.
Derek Pitts. Say your name.
Oh, Mike Csikszentmihalyi.
Lily
His
Yeh.
mic's not. Thank you so much. So yesterday you shared with us these 3 big ideas that you were all thinking about, and we're all dying to know now, after talking with the participants and with each other and reflecting on the thoughts of yesterday, what new insights or ideas have emerged for each of you? No need to raise your hand.
Well, what I was very comforted by was seeing what a convergence of opinion in this group there was about the fact that the learning is not just a computing process. It's not only a cognitive process, but it involves what we usually call the heart as well, and how real education and real knowledge needs to be integration of feeling and knowledge and responsibility, and the feeling that we need that the future is in our hands and we have to do something about it, and it better be good, because otherwise it could get very bad. And I think that has come true in so many of the talks that I heard, and to me that's a very important message. I will go home the richer for it.
Other thoughts?
Sure, I'm happy to add. One of the things coming out of our session yesterday that was sort of reiterated this morning for me is sort of this issue of creativity. I think Lily said something along the lines of that creativity is really the fuel that that ultimately will fire value. This was in response to the question of, okay, in situations of decreasing budgets, how are we going to support some of these things? And I do think you have a couple of different variables. You have age, it's just youth and students. The reality is there is sort of a undifferentiated quality. I mean, we get this in cells. Stem cells are undifferentiated, but eventually they become differentiated, and you can think back to the stage when you weren't whatever it is you do right now as an adult. But the young students are still sort of figuring this out, and they have that quality of knowing enough about an area to comment on it and be creative. And I think part of it is pulling together sort of the forces of creativity and sort of figuring out direction, but also taking advantage of youth, really, as part of the fuel for these systems.
Great.
I think one of the things that has come across to me is the dedication that all of you have to trying to figure out what needs to be done to produce an effective change in how our education systems work, so that we can create not just students who can take a test and achieve a particular level, but students that learn how to learn, that you're interested in teaching them how to become good students, good learners, and eventually become lifelong learners because of your view, as I've come to understand from a number of you, that the objective of being a lifelong learner is much more valuable than being a number on a list or a sheet of paper.
I think one of the issues which became salient for me listening to many different presentations was the importance of a synthesis between what I would call mind and action, and that learning requires both. Not that action doesn't involve mind, but I think we saw some wonderful examples of embodied learning through doing. And I think that the integration of mind, heart, and action together is a combination which I think was exemplified as being particularly important in producing real transformation. And I think that this is an important exemplar for other educational strategies going forward.
I've gotten very clear that those of you who live in Wisconsin have gone through a potentially life-shifting experience with your politics this winter and this early spring. And I'm always looking for places where the learning is evident of the power of community. And I would encourage all of you to keep mining this experience for what it's taught you about just about everything, including your own motivation, your own ability to keep going, what you've learned about solidarity, what you've learned about community, what you've learned about insanity. Because this has been a beautiful learning laboratory for the things that I personally feel are most important going forward. And one of the questions that was raised in my session this morning is a big question for all of us who are engaged in social action. So it's it's vibrating in me still, which is, well, we did all of this. We did nonviolent activism. We stood in solidarity with each other, and it hasn't changed anything. What do we do now? So I feel this personally. It comes up in my own work all the time. When nonviolence does not seem to create immediate impact, what do we do? So do we choose violence? Do we become more aggressive? Or do we just understand that our contribution to the world is to continue to act with less aggression and less fear, lest we become the newer form of those who are oppressing us with their political views or their actions. And in this regard, I just have to bring in His Holiness the Dalai Lama, because he's been the model for the world on how you watch your culture, your country, your people suffer terribly, and yet maintain the path of compassion. Compassion for the Chinese as well as the Tibetans. And one of my favorite stories from this, which I actually use personally quite a lot, is when it's told different ways, but the basic theme is at one point there was a lama who was sent back into Tibet to survey and find out what was going on. And when he came out, he was asked, he said, "Were you ever in danger?" And he said, "Yes, I was in danger all the time." And they said, "Oh, what happened?" And he said, "Well, I was in danger of losing my compassion." And I think that's the walk, and I think you've had a really potent experience, and I hope you continue to talk to each other about it and really access the learnings, because the rest of us need to know what you have already experienced. I think this is going to happen more and more in the future. So I'm grateful that I got to be with you all in Wisconsin at this time.
Thank you. Lily.
I ditto with what everybody else said. Well, it was just such a moving experience for me to be here and to hear the foremost leader in the science technology field, and in addition to my deep gratitude to bring the arts here, I have a couple thoughts to share. And Margaret said yesterday something very, maybe the education is so messed up, we should just tear it down and start again.
No, I didn't say that.
Who said that?
Derek.
Derek said.
Yeah.
Wow. Throw it all out and then start it all over again. Wow, that kind of left me an impression. Okay. So then I thought, we are in the this powerful institution and really looking for a new way of thinking and looking for its soul and its voice in the facing such tremendous challenges. And how do we act that is of benefit to the next generation and not consuming the future in our current generation? And I was moved by that mission. And I was saying, so my feeling, I was in the academic world, and also hearing Margaret mention, a lot how set, like in stone, of the current government driven by the big corporations, and our educational system are taking away the creativity of our young children. The more I hear about it, the more my light is going down and down. And so I just want to reflect on my own course and remind everyone that the structure, the government, is so powerful and so great, and it's awesome and formidable. But always remember, what is outside of the structure is even more immense and infinite. And I was thinking, don't need to waste the powder and blow everything up, because we already have so many abandoned and broken places where there's no structure. The reason my work succeeded where it didn't have a chance in the mainstream culture is because it's in the broken places. There's no structure there. Nobody is even looking, and little resources. Yet, all the deficits And all the weakness became the reason the project took roots. And then and have time for us to make mistakes and have time to find our own voice and our own identity and our own artistic sensitivity. And I always feel ethics, aesthetics is not just about beauty abstract. It to express our being, our heart, and our soul. And that's connected to ethics, who we are, and how do we shape our life, and so forth. And so I would say that, you know, in this powerful university, and so supportive of change and new way of thinking, and then take all that the support you can. But remember, there is infinite open space for innovation and a chance to really take action and make mistakes and fall down on your face. And you got up. Now got characters, right? And then form a new way, invention, creativity. And when we are in our creative mode, and when we are aware, I think our panel talked a lot about compassion and so forth, and I feel I talked about action. Action is not just you always have to go and save somebody, no. I think the first action is aware of our thinking and our what we do, awareness of ourselves. I think now it's so globally connected, and so connected inside, manifested outside. What we buy, what we consume, what we eat, and how we vote, and all that has a global impact. I think that is the most very powerful action, is that awareness, our mind consciousness that the happy person talked about. Richard, happiness, yeah, and
Nice.
all of us talked about. And that is the beginning of action. And when we are aware of that, then we are aware of the light in us. And that light keeps us away from the shadow in us. I don't know about you. Every day I struggle with the greed in me, the selfishness, the egohood. I want to be seen. Here I am. And then the other voice, if I become aware, then it becomes a light that push the shadow away, that make it diminish. But it's always there. And that's where it began. Every one of us is responsible, and for the global change, it can happen, but it take all our light lit and pass on, and then we will succeed. That's what I got from the conference and from
Great.
everybody else.
Thank you.
Thank you. So it's been so fun for us to see the six of you get to know each other and talk with one another. And so what we're wondering is, what do you want to ask of each other in front of the group? Are there things that have come up that you want to challenge, perhaps, or that you're struggling with and don't quite agree with or want to understand better? What is it that you want to ask of each other?
I have a question.
Sure.
I am so fascinated by micro, or the micro, 90% of me, myself, micro thing, yeah. And then the microbiology. And I want to work with you, science, you know, and how?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think, and we had this dialogue last night over beers. Good place to continue this kind of dialogue. And I do think, again, it's interesting to pull together this sort of diversity, and it's not common for me. You know, I think all of us do this regularly, and maybe for you folks, I normally I'm with the earthquake folks and the, I'm with volcanologists, and I tend to be natural disaster, generally. I don't get to hang out with artists and physicists and organizational folks and people thinking about compassion, and I think it really is sort of wonderful. And I do think there is commonality, and maybe this goes back to some of the flow issues, or there is a common theme to intensity, really. Figuring out what you love and really exploiting it and going after it. And I think you get into that zone, and it's when you can most effectively communicate with people. It's when you think of the sort of most interesting ideas. And it's also when you combine that with folks that are interested and students and people who are willing to sort of take that in. And I do think that creativity is one common area. I mean, one of the things we talked about very pragmatically is just some of the sites that we work in. I work in one site which is one of the more interesting places I've ever been in the world. It's in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and it's a place that you can basically only get to by boat during the during the rainy season when you have water that goes all the way there. But it's hit or miss. 70% of the year you can't get there except for by a small plane. And it's a place where people get around mostly through walking. So roads and cars have changed so profoundly the way that we interact and the way that our villages form and the way that we live as communities. Villages all throughout sub-Saharan Africa now, they're along roads. But that's not traditionally the way we lived. Humans lived in small settlements and we moved by foot. And it would be really interesting for me to see sort of, artistic cultures obviously are so different in different parts of the world. I mean, I would love to sort of see how your art would flourish in those. I mean, that's just in some ways selfishly. They happen to be an interesting population. I thought about it, very intensely when you were talking about your work in Rwanda, in the sense that some of these populations have been subject to, continuing warfare and basically wars against humanity, effectively. These have been populations where there's an entire generation of children they're all about roughly the same age, and they were the result of systematic rape of populations. And one of the things that's so striking to me, I mean, I'm there for completely different purposes, but it's amazing that, of course, there's so much love for these children, and why wouldn't there be? And it's not that there isn't sort of complex feelings and paradox and complexity, but at the end of the day, people find a remarkable way to live and to thrive. And it just, I mean, for me, again, it would be so interesting to see your work there. That may be the closest I could get. But I think it's a fun dialogue.
Right.
At least for me, one of the questions I have, just sort of continuing in your response, I guess this might be for Meg, is just organizationally, one of the things for me personally as I moved from being sort of an academic scientist to running an independent research institute, I'm very interested in sort of the entrepreneurial sides. Like, how can we manage to create organizations that most encourage the sort of creativity we're talking about and the energy that we're talking about, and don't sort of restrict people to thinking about, my life is about papers, or even my life is about saving the world, or my life is about businesses, but how do we sort of combine this energy, more like a workshop? When I think about what I do, ultimately, it's somebody referred to it the other day as like a microbial hacker shop. And in some ways, it's about getting like-minded people together and be open to a whole range of different tools to address problems, not even a specific set of problems, but can you continue to be sort of productive and engaging with that sort of openness and in terms of an organization. I mean, we're trying to pull that off, but it's hard because people constantly say, well, is it a nonprofit? Is it a for-profit? Are you a research institute? Are you an incubator? And my answer is pretty much yes.
Yes, right.
But can we do it?
Yeah. Well, I think I want to refer you to Leadership in the New Science, which was my first book.
Okay.
Because there's a huge amount to talk about there, but one of the things I really want to underline right now, we could talk some more later too, is what I've appreciated about this group of colleagues is we're all very different. We're all looking at things at a very different level of scale. So from the individual as learner, as artist, to community, to education, to the role of science in society, to how the planet works, which is what I see as your work, to the human heart and mind. And the one thing I don't want to do is smush us all together. because I think it's really instructive and delightful that we're all, yes, there is common ground, but I just know that it's there, but I'm more interested in the particularities and specificities of how we're different. But one of the ways I personally have been combining our different sets of expertise and our different passions is, so you mentioned the Democratic Republic of Congo. I immediately go into my feminist space about this is the one place on the planet where there has been such outrage against the divine feminine, is how I position it. Right. That what's been done to women, it's still continuing in the Congo. For me, just feels like an absolute assault on women, children, and therefore the future. And it's writ large in the DRC. It's happening in many places, but so I hear that, and then the strong emotions I have are very familiar to me of outrage, grief, rage, loss. And then when I hear, you know, Derek speak about the planet, and I work with a number of scientists still, and there's the cognitive level at which scientists can be very clear about the impact of global climate change, the future, predicting the future from models that are actually, some of them are very effective. It's just we thought we had more time. And then I go to how scientists, and I'm thinking now of some of the national park superintendents I work with, are holding their own grief and rage around the lack of public recognition that global climate change is happening. And I've been in conversations with people who manage these large landscapes. They are seeing the impact of species loss. They say, I'm playing God. I'm deciding which species we're going to preserve and which we're going to let go of. And we don't talk about that because we're in this pseudo-scientific culture which says you don't deal with your strong emotions. So I'm feeling these currents that, you know, one of the things that I wrote about is we need to acknowledge these very strong emotions that we're in now. We express it through art, and we transform them when we get engaged in creating change wherever we can be. And of course, this is what your work in part, you know, the way we transform our hearts, and we can prove it, you know, with data, but the way we transform our hearts and become more compassionate is to work with others, to work on behalf of these issues, but in the complexity, the fullness of being human. So it's the science and the emotional art and the the creativity that's inherent in all of us, and the compulsion that, you know, if we see something, we have to act on it. So I'm just putting that all together in a way that's, for me, very
If I could chime in for a second. Thank you for sharing that. I think one of the things that we're sensing and picking up from the room, from the feedback, is this question of, we've heard fantastic things, we're inspired by the research, but how do we make it practical and relevant from the day-to-day experience? I think what we experienced here in Wisconsin was an extreme situation. I mean, and it required an extreme response that, to a certain extent, brought the best out of us. But how do you make that manifest in the day-to-day experience? And I'm particularly wanting to connect it to, you know, the education system. There's a lot of questions about the challenges and flaws that we have when we think of big education and what that looks like. How do we manifest some of those changes on a smaller level, be it in the classroom or community level, or even in the types of research and outreach that you all do? Any thoughts on that?
Well, I'd be happy to start. I think that one issue for me, which is salient from my what insights I've gleaned from contemplative traditions as well as insights that I've gleaned from science, is the importance of reminders. And what I mean by that is this. I think that in terms of translating some of these things into everyday life, it is so easy for us to get lost in the activities of our everyday living, in the hustle and bustle of our everyday worlds, in the stimuli which pull us externally, and building our environments in such a way to have helpful reminders on a periodic basis throughout the day to remind us of our humanity, to remind us of the importance of gratitude, to remind us of the need for humility, to remind us of the importance of compassion, to have some simple cues which provide those kinds of helpful reminders that are just sprinkled in what we do. And we talked a little bit about the workplace and how we can have workplace settings that are conducive to these qualities. And I think, again, building in reminders of that sort from both the perspective of knowing about the brain and what those kinds of cues actually do to the brain when we observe them or when we hear them or when we touch them, whatever those cues might be. And this also informs what we're actually doing in the classroom, where we're going in and having curricula that teach mindfulness and kindness. And the root of the word mindfulness in Sanskrit comes from familiarization and remembering. There's a quality of remembrance, and that quality of remembrance is this issue of having a reminder to help bring one back to these basic issues of our humanity that I think can color our everyday transactions in really important ways.
If I could follow up, as another question, what do you say to the skeptic or the critic who supports the idea of value-added ways of assessing impact of instruction in the classroom? What do you say to that individual when you talk about reminders and with happiness? I think there was quite a bit of buzz yesterday about those practices and exercises that you were talking about in your study. I know I want to practice a couple of them. Anybody else? Yeah? So would you mind addressing those two factors, the component of the research, and then also to that critic that says, you know, what you do is really insignificant. It doesn't make as much of an impact when you look at it from a fiscal perspective.
Well, as I shared in the group that I met with early this morning, in a recent meta-analysis that involves aggregating across many studies that involve more than 280,000 school children in the United States, cultivating these social and emotional qualities, not cognitive learning, purely social and emotional qualities, led to an average of an 11-point increase on standardized test scores. There's no school administrator in this country who's not going to want their school system to increase in that way. And the gains that are seen on these standardized tests are more significant than the gains that are seen in many programs that explicitly attempt to train cognitive learning. And so I think that, and in terms of economic benefit that you ask about, one of the conjectures that I think that I have, and actually there's now, we have for the first time the first openly declared meditator in the United States Congress. His name is Tim Ryan, and he comes from a district in Ohio. And Tim asked me about a year ago, he said, what's the most important study that the government can fund in this area? And I said, it has nothing to do with the kind of work that I do. The most important study to fund is a study on the impact of these practices on healthcare utilization. Because it's my conjecture that healthcare utilization is actually going to decrease. And if healthcare utilization decreases, even if it decreases by a few percentage points, the amount of dollars that that saves on the bottom line is enormous. And so I think that these are really concrete steps that need to be explored. And if these predictions turn out to be reasonable, I think they will make a difference in terms of the bottom line.
And we'll get those practices from you later, those exercises?
I actually led my group through the practices.
Oh, okay,
this morning,
great.
So,
Excellent. Derek, you look like you wanted to respond earlier to that first part
Well,
of
you
the
know,
question.
it's two things really. One is going back to your earlier question that
Yes.
Meg responded to, and maybe it was actually from Kathy about what it was we wanted to ask of each other, or things that we wanted to recognize. And one of the things that I recognize, I think it's following up on what Meg said, is that all of us here represent these sort of different slices of experience and different slices in education and those sorts of things. And to me, it reflects this idea that when we think about education and learning, people learn in so many different ways. There are so many different access points that can be had to a person to affect learning or to provide a learning opportunity. And I think it's important not to ignore what those possibilities might be, what those avenues might be, and I think we all represent, you know, some of these various avenues for doing that. I find that to be incredibly important in the work that I do, in that in the informal science education sort of landscape, in the kind of work that I do, working with visitors that come to the museum that are going to look at an exhibition and they want to try to get something out of it, want to try to understand something about it, I have learned that I've got about, I'll stretch it to about a 10-second window in which I can sort of jump in and do something with them. But I have to be able to assess what it is they want, how much of it they want, in what form would they like it, and, you know, figure out the best way to get it to them. And if I can't get in there in that 10-second window, then I've lost this opportunity. So it requires that, I feel like it requires that I be able to try to have the ability to come from a number of different points of view. So I really value the opportunity to learn from everybody here to try to get there. And since each one of us represents one of those slices, I think that's really important. And so, in these different ways of doing this, as Richie is talking about here, I think this again represents exactly that kind of thing. People learn in different ways. They come at things from different points of view. We have to be able to take advantage of any one of those so that we can provide this opportunity for them to learn. And so I think they become very important because this appeals to the holistic sense of who the learners are. And so we have to keep that in mind as well. They're not empty vessels waiting to be filled. They are people who are curious and want to learn about the world, but we have to be able to approach them where they are in order to make that happen, or there can be a big rejection. I had a great conversation yesterday afternoon with, she's here somewhere, about how it's very, very important to try to approach people where they are. Otherwise, you're not helping them, but instead what's happening is that you're not approaching them where they live. You can't gain access to them because you're not on their level. They can't see where you are because of the disconnect between you, and then that opportunity is lost.
Right.
Yeah, it seems like one of the themes here that is coming out is partly an issue of integration of different levels and different levels. I think we have.
I'm going to ask you to hold for a second because I think we're having trouble hearing
what
you.
You're saying.
And
okay.
I don't want to pretend that this mic isn't an issue, so let me help you out here.
Okay.
These are the musical theater mics that they usually tape to the side of your face. I don't know if you want to tape on the side of your face, but I only know this because I'm in the theater, and we know we're supposed to bend it and angle it and let it sit there. Hope you don't mind me touching your ear, but
It's
you're still
not my
beautiful.
ear that's at fault.
Oh, no, it's not your ear. You're right. You're absolutely right. The ear isn't the problem. But this mic won't stay on the ear.
All right.
Let me get that there for you. All right.
Thank you.
You good?
It's
Are we good?
For me, I hope it's good.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Here we go.
So,
Take two.
thank you. That we are talking in part on the issue of integration at various levels of within the person, across people. And I think the Western civilization has gone a long way by being able to separate things in compartments and abstract them and be able to study chemistry on one hand without wondering what it's good for really, or where the limits are of the use of chemistry or physics or what have you. The problem we have that, and this is true also, the segregation of institutions. The schools, for many kids, are foreign territory. And you go into from the home where you feel that hopefully you feel accepted and cared for, and you go into a completely anonymous place where you have to now organize your mind in a different way according to other people's dictates. I've been following some of the countries that do well on the international comparisons in terms of educational success, the PISA analysis, and the country that tends to do best, at least in the first primary and secondary school, is Finland, and then followed by some Asian countries like Singapore and so forth. Well, if you look at Finland, for instance, they are using much less of proportionately in dollar amounts on their education than we do, or than even the neighboring Denmark is 4 times as much expense per capita in the primary schools. But Finland has a different way they consider the school as an extension of the family. And the first duty of the principal of an elementary school is to stand at the door of the school and shake hands with every student every day and ask them, you know, how is your uncle? I heard that he had this kind of problem. Is it better? And you say, yeah. And say, how is your brother? I heard he scored in the football game, in the soccer game, you know, and how the child entering the school knows that he is in a place that is part of his life. It's really part of his extension of his life. And he's treated there essentially as a person with its own history, its own background, but which is welcomed and integrated into the school. Now, that's one way of doing it. Singapore does it very differently, but even there it's much more hierarchical, top-down. But the student knows that they have a role to play in this institution, and they better do it, because otherwise there's going to be all kinds of repercussions. But it's a much less congenial, comfortable place, but also is able to convey information by the way it's operating, and by including the child into a common enterprise that he's part of, or she's part of. So I think we need to break down some of these barriers, which barriers between the heart and the mind, the barrier between action and memorizing, the barriers between home and school, and reconstitute an environment that is not only child-centered, but where the child is part of a global, or at least a greater entity than himself. One of my favorite visions of education was written by Aldous Huxley, who was a British novelist. He had one book that's not well known. It's called Island, and it's about a community that finds itself isolated from the rest of the world, and they had to reconstitute it's a little bit like scrapping everything, have to start from school. And there they decide that the first 3 years of a child's education would be rock climbing, because when you are forced to let your life be in the hands of somebody else and then be responsible for the life of someone else, you learn that you belong to you have to support and be supported. And it sounds like a fanciful image, but I think it's true that we have lost, for instance, the notion that kids are responsible for their life and the life of their family, and others are responsible for them. And this kind of community needs to be established very early, and the schools don't do a very good job of that. And I think, well, we can go on and on, otherwise I agree with everybody else.
Thank you. Thank you. Other thoughts? Anybody else want to?
Yeah, I just want to mention something else that I hear, going back to your question, Patrick, of what do we actually do? Any of you know Mike Holmes? Mike Holmes is a guy who's on Canadian television. He remodels houses and things. You know Mike Holmes? Okay, so you know what Mike Holmes always does. He goes into this is also an answer to Lily's question a little bit earlier. You know, Mike Holmes goes into a situation, makes an assessment, and what does he do? He says, tear it all out and start over again. Okay, so it seems like I'm from the Mike Holmes school of sort of school reform here. But I wanted to go back to something else that's sort of connected to this, that Mihai is talking about here, that I think is really important. It's the idea of how do you get the school to become such an integral part of the community and the family life, because they go together so tightly. The kid spends time at home with the family, and then during the day goes to another family, a different family, and spends a full day there, and then comes back and goes back to a separate kind of family, and there's not, in some ways, there may not be enough interaction between these two families to make like a whole thing. And I remember reading some ideas written by Neil Postman, who talks a lot about reforming education systems, in which he put forth an idea that perhaps one thing that could happen is that there's much greater integration between schools and the home life in the community, and it's a much bigger whole piece of things that the school provides in support of the child that's in the school, in support of the family, to make all this work. And I know that some of this happens right now, but when you ask the question, what are the things that we can do right now? Yeah, I'm from the Mike Holmes School, but that's not really the most practical thing to do immediately. On the other hand, there's so much that can be done in communities to foster this idea of education as a good thing, and how do we change the person that's in the school and sort of bring all these different sort of, not perspectives, but all these different sort of influences on the human as part of this learning experience. So it's not just about how do I learn to master this material so I can score highly on the test, but how does this influence me as a human, and how do I put all this in together with my more formal education to help me become a better rounded human being that in the end loves to learn. So I'm always looking at these different ways of trying to do this in communities. I like to try to empower kids with information about astronomy and ways in which they can look at the night sky that gives them something they can take back to their community and share with that community, that empowers the child and then, you know, gives them something to share, makes them feel a little bit bigger, you know, all these sorts of things, trying to build up that individual who's in this environment of, you know, let me take in this information that I then have to put back on a test kind of thing. And I think these things are extraordinarily important and something that we all have a piece in doing. As we talked about yesterday with responsibility, I used to wear a cap that said on the back, each one, reach one, teach one. And I still think that's very important, and we all have that responsibility to try to reach out and do that. I know we all do that in the ways that we do, but there are still other ways in which that can be applied to help make a change someplace.
Well, I think following that idea, let's take advantage of the wisdom in this community. I know there are questions that are probably burgeoning in the audience. We do have folks who will be running with microphones. If there are questions.
Can I just comment to
Yes.
this? Sorry, okay. I just want to put in my 2 cents. I always feel worried when I hear when we talk the ideal would be cultivating community spirit, cultivating compassion, and treating school as an extension of family. I think that's the ideal. And I was thinking in inner city, that's where I work, and it's probably far from ideal. And those situations depends on other people doing things. And I always feel anxious, what can individual do? What can a teacher do while we're losing our children, okay? And so through the conversation, 2 pictures came to my mind. One is that the Angkor Wat, the picture when Angkor Wat was discovered, it's huge mountain-like temples, and then wrapped in the tree banyan roots, and the roots split it apart. Okay, that's one picture that left me. And so my answer is that so individual, so small, in face of such powerful trans-international corporations that even bypass the government. So where's the power of individual? And I was just thinking of that banyan tree and what it is that you bring life. You do positive thing wherever you can. Our education system is such that it smothers the creativity, but that's where we live. We cannot change it. We have to work in this system. And I think this is what Richard, talk about the mindset. And sometimes the mindset from the negative to the positive, from the looking at the water half cup full, half cup empty, it's just a switch of the mind. Doesn't take money, doesn't take more space. It's just that switch and our commitment, willingness to look at things positively. Didn't I quote you right? Okay. So that when we do the positive thing, then we bring air, we bring nutrient to ourselves, into the space we're in. And that's like the little banyan tree. And if we all do that, we don't throw eggs against the concrete because we just crash. That's what Margaret talked about. When all nonviolence action and bear no result, what do? Don't take on other people's issue and just be where you are and hold your light and do positive thing so that we can live the day well and then we can sleep well in the night, okay? That's one thing, patience, and just work on the positive. And so eventually, like the banyan tree, it would split the concrete apart. The second thing is that when I first become acquainted with Islamic religion, and then I see they always have to pray 5 times a day, and then pray to certain direction, right? And have to prostrate. And I was so ignorant. I said, that's a lot of trouble. Breaks your day. And then you have to find the right direction, and then you have to prostrate all this. Why don't we do it all in one time and 5 times in one time? And then when I become more mature, and I was just thinking, wow, how wonderful. Because we are so easily swept away by the mundane activities. And then, so 5 times a day, we are reminded where is the center. And it's like finding our center. And then, we're reminded what is important. And this morning, I had such a blessing to work with in the workshop. And I remember that we didn't know how to paint, we didn't know how to sing, and we just came together and we just jumped in the water and we start to splash, and wonderful things came out. And what made impression for me is that I entered into it. No matter how many times you do, you always have butterfly in your stomach. Is it going to crash today? Is it going to? And then I remember the 3 deep breathing, and that just changed my being. And then, so all that doesn't take money, it depends on the action of other people, and just simply we root ourselves, and then we be true to ourselves. And then, and taking positive action in education. Yesterday, somebody said compassionate education, such a good thing, you know. One, I think, is that just by listening, I think our panel said there is a lot of wisdom out there. And then, so we have great wisdom in this room, our expertise. But if we can listen, it humbles ourselves, and then we honor the other person. That's how you nurture a child. You give space by listening to the child. And then it's like you say, we go to them, you know, and that's the compassion Nihai talking about. And so that's positive action and centering and can happen here right now.
We have a question here, and there are a few hands that are starting to pop up, and so we'll kind of do this one side to the other, if that's okay.
Great segue, Lily, thanks.
I'd like to just ask the panel, one thing I'm hearing about education, I'm a family physician. I worry that they're just, between all the technology kids have now, that it takes all their time, that the time goes. And there isn't that time for them to ponder or come up with, as Lily said, that switch that probably was implicated in Derek's experience on the streets, thinking about the solar system, or that's the germ for any idea, which is creativity, which often is a solution. And it's hard because the curriculums keep getting bigger and bigger. We have more to teach, more to learn. Things go faster. I see it in the adult sphere and work, productivity, RVUs, etc. I feel like something needs to be addressed when we look at education or our experience as humans before the next pandemic. Do we have enough time for the brain? And I sort of see scientific inquiry and artistic expression as similar. It's an idea. It comes from we're not sure where. But there has to be that pondering time. And I worry that that is being lost in our public education and might have been what brought a lot of creativity to our educational system in the past, perhaps more so than some other more rote-based educational systems globally. If anyone wanted to comment.
I'll comment on that. I work with a lot of teachers, and they're an incredibly depressed group of professionals now. In fact, I can't be in a circle conversation with administrators without somebody crying. It's a quality of despair about sort of having their profession taken from them by this incessant demand for testing and the loss of learning environments in the schools, which they feel acutely. And several years ago, after talking to one of my granddaughters, who was 13 at the time, I wrote an article called Stressed Out Kids. And one of the things that it seems now that was a more calm, temperate, spacious time, but even in that time, which was maybe, must have been 8, 10 years ago, just noticing where do our children find quiet? what does silence mean to a child? Because in most instances, the idea of being bored has just disappeared as a good thing from our culture. And the idea of sitting quietly without something in your ear or something going on, it's usually more than one thing going on. So what that's doing to the development of kids' brains, I mean, I'd be really interested in hearing from either one of you, but especially you, Richie, that we just have to notice this kind of the frequency and noise with which children are, what children think are normal now. You know, which is to be constantly entertained, and if it doesn't work, you know, they won't even listen to a song all the way through now. You know, just keep switching, and you see this the pace of and the frequency of things. I see acutely when I'm in a movie theater and I'm watching trailers for new movies, which is it shifts like every half second, the scene of action and such. So you gave space by saying it was 10-second window. And I think we're just observing this now. It's a critical issue.
Well, I have a few reflections about this. It's a great question. And let me just start by saying yesterday when I was talking to some folks who had been involved in the development of Union South, and I said, where in Union South is there a place for a student to be quiet? And this is actually a question that I asked our chancellor a couple of years ago. Where are spaces on campus where students can actually go to be quiet? So this is not just something that is critical for our elementary and middle school and high school children. It's also critical in our institutions of higher learning. And so I think that that is really a very important issue, and one of the things that we've been doing with our curriculum with mindfulness and kindness. And I should also just take this opportunity to acknowledge some of you were in my session this morning and saw this video that I showed, and it featured the extraordinary work of a person who is on our staff, Laura Pinger, who is sitting here. And Laura is, I mean, the reason we can do this is because there are people like Laura who can embody these qualities in the classroom. And one of the things that we're doing in this work is creating opportunities for students to, in fact, learn to be with silence for short periods of time. But having said that, let me mention two other things, and that is that a number of years ago we decided that if you can't beat them, we should join them. And so we're actually working with some video game makers to utilize video game technology to actually cultivate internal awareness. And we think that it's possible, and we think that we can actually harness these methods in a way which takes good advantage of the sort of contemporary scene and also insights that we glean from other very different traditions. And we'll have more to say on that in a few years, but I think it's possible. The third thing that I wanted to mention that hasn't been mentioned yet, but apropos of your question, is that we have in our country today, particularly among the young people, a national sleep debt. And that sleep debt is just extraordinarily critical and is exacting a toll on the mental and physical health of our youth. And that is really a national emergency which is not being addressed. And I think that the start of school at these crazy hours when teenage brains are not designed to be awake I mean, it's just so radically inconsistent with what we know about biology. And so I think that this is another issue which needs to be taken into account. And some of the the deleterious and sort of tragic, in many cases, trajectories that we see youth going on is at least in part a consequence of a sleep deprivation. So these are all things that I think need to be addressed.
I'd like to actually echo, Richie, your second point and pull back to something that Patrick asked earlier, which is, what can we do today, and also how can we use some of these technologies to our advantages? And I do think, look, we can all sort of wring our hands about, the sort of social media revolution, how much time we spend looking at screens and how much kids spend looking at screens. And I think it's worthwhile to do that and think about the consequences. But it's also sort of, on the flip side, important to try to utilize these things to our advantage. And I do think when we're trying to inspire kids through education, one of the things, every time period likes to think that they're the most interesting and exciting time period, but ours is. I really do think, and it's not to say that there haven't been a number of them previous to ours, but we're experiencing a series of crises and connectivity that is really unprecedented, not only in the history of our species, but in the history of life on our planet. And as a biologist, I'm very cautious about stating that, but our capacity to move around the planet and move different things around the planet at speed is extraordinary and unprecedented, and it leads to a whole range of consequences. I mean, from my perspective, it's this interconnectivity that permits viruses to move at light speed and to create the kinds of pandemics that we see and we will continue to see. And that's just a feature of our world. And there's a number of these issues we've referred to, whether it's sort of global warming, whether it's the capacity for warfare, whether it's all these other issues. But I think what we need to do is grab a hold of these kids and figure out what they're excited about, shake them up, and also figure out ways to utilize some of these technologies to our advantage. When I think about the problem of pandemics, and we talked about this in our session this morning, it is amazing the connectivity we have. Yes, the connectivity leads to viruses moving around, but it also leads to the capacity to move information around, to know where people are sick much more quickly, to respond in a completely different way. So I think, ultimately we are going to need to a certain extent, embrace these technologies while we recognize the costs and how they're changing the nature of the human psyche, and trying to be responsive to that. And we do have biological needs. It's not like our need for sleep is going to disappear. On the other hand, we better well use these technologies to our advantage because we're experiencing some of the most serious crises that we've ever had, in our human history right now. And if we don't use these tools, we're going to lose these battles.
Is there a question from this side of the room anywhere? No, we got tons over here. This one first and then Jen. Yeah.
Thank you. I want to return to the question about getting kids moving. About getting kids moving and getting them outdoors. I want to refer everyone to the College of Ag and Life Sciences. There's a man named Sam Dennis who is also working with someone who is a physician in our School of Medicine. And Sam Dennis's programs are working in children's environments. And what he did, he presented to a group of us a year or so ago, is he said, why are we not getting our children out in nature and allowing them to be bored and allowing them to sit and ponder a toad or a fly or tree bark? And he's doing a wonderful job. So we are achieving some goals in this regard. And I hope any of you who are interested in that, check Sam Dennis out in the College of Ag and Life Sciences. He's a landscape architect who said he goes into parks and does development, and the first thing kids say is, there's no play structure. There's no team. There's no activity that we have to be shuttled from day to day at 3 to 5 and those type of things. And that's exactly what he's achieving, is he's striving for boredom in nature. Thank you.
Well, Michelle Obama has a national initiative called Let's Move Outdoors that involves national parks, and involves physicians and there's even now a program for physicians to write prescriptions for people to go outdoors and be with nature rather than be given drugs. It's just a nascent movement, but it's all in that same direction. I hope he knows of it, maybe has even evolved.
And if I can just mention one other thing along those lines, we've been developing a relationship with the Boys and Girls Club here in Madison that works with a segment of the population that we don't see here at the university. Many of these kids are homeless. They really come from the most difficult environments in our city. And the director of the Dane County Boys and Girls Club is a real visionary. And there is a center in South Madison, just off Park Street here, where they have this amazing garden in the middle of this very challenging neighborhood. And these kids are actually hanging out in nature. And I was there recently visiting, and it was just an extraordinarily moving experience for me to see this center planted in this neighborhood and having the kind of impact that it does. And so there are indeed opportunities that exist in our local community.
Question there?
I wanted to not leave with the impression that nothing has happened or is happening after the Capitol protests. There's a tremendous amount happening. It's the banyan tree. So we all showed up at the Capitol day after day after day in blistering, horrible winds and cold, and we came together in solidarity, 100,000 people plus often. And then we all went to work. And so all over our state, we're activated now. And I'm, in fact, doing some training this weekend with team leaders in Madison, and our structure is a non-structure of small neighborhood groups and training them in leadership capacity building skills so that we can take back our state. And we're running recall elections, and we're running progressive candidates, and in the process of that, people have become activated who were never involved in politics before and will always be involved in the political life now, going forward.
Great, thank you, John.
We have a few hands up front that have been up for a while. We have another mic over here, right? Get some people over front here.
Hi, I'm a returning adult, gray-headed grad student, but I study social capital, so that was my lens that I've been listening, applying to everything I've been hearing. And I've heard social capital, is about relationships and trust and shared values and things like that. And so that's what I heard Nathan say this morning that he was able to collect specimens because of trust that was established and a great communicator that he worked with. And Lily mentioned yesterday, and I'll just give these two examples, that the Rwandan refugees, when they first came there, didn't know each other. They were all separate. They were just alone with their grief in a crowd. And then when the tide turned is when they were connected to each other. And so I'd like each of you to sort of comment on the importance of relationships and trust in forwarding every agenda that you've talked about, because I'm sure it plays a different role in each one.
Sure, I'm happy to start with that. And I think maybe that is another great theme, in addition to sort of creativity has been one of the themes that we've talked about. And I do think fundamentally, we all do these incredibly different things. But yes, at the core of it is relationships. And it's very interesting the way that the US government is addressing sort of biological threats, whether they be natural threats like pandemics or bioterror or accidental, by what we call bioerror. It's really interesting across all these Department of State, USAID, DOD, and it's basically, they call it biological engagement. And really what we found is that the most important way to both sort of catch things naturally that could be harmful to the world, but also to sort of take control of possible purposeful threats, right? Because there is the potential that people will introduce things purposely to harm, viruses to harm people, bioterror, something that's been attempted on a number of occasions, is to engage scientists. We basically need to be establishing relationships and fostering communication between scientists. And ultimately, it's that dialogue which it creates a community. And at the end of the day, I work in China, for example. It's an interesting example. And there can be different kinds of tensions at different levels between different countries. At the end of the day, you sit down with a scientist and you start talking about the real problem of how do we collect specimens, how do we sample the right kind of populations, and all of those things just disappear. At the end of the day, it's just about coming together to solve a problem. And I think that, your point is really well taken, that ultimately it's sort of fostering these kinds of connections that will help us to, both enrich lives, but also to solve important problems.
I think one of the keys in our own work to this issue of trust, which I think is really critical, and this is something that, whenever I'm with the Dalai Lama, he'll always ask scientists this question. He says, what's your motivation for doing this work? I want to really understand your motivation. And when the motivation for doing the work is clear, and if the motivation is to be of benefit to others, that provides a substrate of trust that enables a lot to go forward based on that. The other thing I wanted to say about trust is that trust actually is becoming a hot topic in social neuroscience. There are a lot of neuroscientists who are now studying trust. It also crosses over into a new hybrid discipline called neuroeconomics. And there are specific ways in which trust can be assessed in the laboratory. And one of the things that we've learned very clearly about trust is that fear inhibits trust. And the brain systems that are important for fear directly inhibit the brain systems that are involved in trust. And I think this is something very important. It's got an important message for us. I think that the hijacking by certain entities in our culture through the media of elevating fear has resulted in a kind of national decline in trust. And so I think that we can all work on our own minds so that we're less vulnerable to those influences which activate fear. And by doing that, I think we can directly help to facilitate trust.
If I could, I just want to ask one question. I see, Mihai, you have a comment you wanted to give as well. It's a comment that both Mihai and Lily, you made yesterday that seemed to be at odds. At one point, when we talk about flow theory, fear being a major inhibitor of achieving flow, yet in the arts, Lily, you specifically commented that fear was a good thing. And I know for me as an artist, sometimes if it's nothing more than vanity, the fear of looking like an idiot when I'm working on whatever the material that I'm working on, be it a show, directing a project, etc., I would say that perhaps is a healthy kind of fear, but yet here you describe fear in another context, so it's manifesting in a variety of ways. So I'd like to hear the three of you comment, and then, of course, you as well, Nathan.
I mean, just one quick comment, and that is that it's an interesting point that you're making, Patrick, and I would simply ask whether the fear that you're talking about is preceding your entry into that activity, or whether it's actually present during the activity. My sense is that the fear may motivate the activity, but once you're immersed in doing the art, the fear is gone.
Yes, that's true.
Very good.
Yeah. It's a heck of a motivator.
I would come to this issue from the other side, which is one of the things that in our study of really creative individuals in different fields, one of the things that surprised me is how, when asked what was the most important quality they thought a person in their field who is creative should have or has to have, whether it was an economist, a physicist, an artist, they all came up with saying that you have to be honest, that honesty is the prerequisite to accomplish an important issue, important finding, and important accomplishment. And the honesty was defined differently from an artist. Defined it in terms of their feelings, their experience, their own personal belief, integrity. They had to be true to that. They had to be. But if you are an artist without being honest to yourself, you don't generate trust in the audience. A mathematician, of course, would say, well, listen, I mean, you can't be a mathematician if you're cheating at, I mean, it's integral to your domain. And you would immediately lose all confidence on the part of others if you cheated. And the same thing down the line, physicists or psychologists, so you have, in order to have trust, you have to be in an environment where people are honest and tell you the truth. Otherwise, trust is dysfunctional, you know, in a bad system. So I think what we can do, if we want to operate in a good system, is to be first of all honest about what we do, and that will maybe create trust in others, but it's the first step. Otherwise, you can't expect trust.
Willie or Nathan, did you have comments?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I remember a story, a comment. So when I was working in North Philadelphia, this abandoned land, and trying to make it more beautiful with trees and so forth. So a child came to me and said, well, is this your property? You do this for yourself? And then I said, no, and nothing here is mine, but it's all yours. And so that's one thing I remembered. The second thing was that when I first did the Rwandan project, and doing the genocide memorial was very, very frightening to me. And I didn't want to touch it because it's connected to the deep national grief. And then if anything, bones get soft, then I will be such a, just it's so terrible to bear. And also, there was a problem with people trusting, and they say, well, there have been nonprofit before, and they were saying, you come here, you use us to raise money for your own gain, right? So, and then they saw how careful the monument is being designed, the process that they are engaged, and the words all came from them. All design stages were connected, were consulted with them. And there was one major mistake, because it has that undulating mounds, which is like mountain wave I like so much. And so as an artist, I just put the undulating line tiles to echo that. Wow, that touched a deep nerve. And they were so upset. They say, you come to trick us because you put snake on that monument. And I said, no, but why? They say, because they were caught by the Hutus, they were caught the cockroaches and snakes. And I said, oh, please, take it off, take it down, and do whatever you deem as beautiful. And in the video you saw, I put flowers at the monument, and then so at the end you saw no flowers. And then because the local government and the leaders felt it's so grave that it cannot have flowers, okay? So then no flowers, that's great. And the way I designed it, it was all white. The wall was white. And then so when I look at it again, it's all painted purple and more beautiful. And why? Because purple is the color of mourning. So I said, this is great, co-creative, make it more their own, and then all together. And at the end, in 2007, we have a big celebration, and we dedicated the monument and gave it to the people. And so now they keep it alive. And when they collect bones, they continue to do. And then they intern the bones into the bone chamber. That's why I call it a living museum. And so I think what here we talked about, like being honest, being true to yourself. And especially if we do public work, take yourself out of it. And just be true to why you are there, and no gain. Because the minute the selfish gain that you're thinking about, what do I gain out of it, then you totally lose the balance. And that's how, one more thing was that sometimes it just takes patience. Words cannot just say, you trust me. And I remember in North Philadelphia, they thought I was this crazy Chinese woman coming into here and do those things. And then so, when the world didn't trust you, and especially a community of many, many broken dreams, you can't convince them. And so, but who trusted? The children. They know what's real and what's real energy and what's real there, and they came to our rescue. 3 summers later, adults drift in. And she said, they say that she's all right. She worked with our children. She's not taking things away. She came back. And that's how the project become rooted in the community. And that's how trust was established in there. One more thing. We're in the drug district. In the heart of village, there are 2 drug houses. The first person who came and helped me, Jojo, it's like mercury. Working with mercury, he used the drugs. And how eventually, and so people say that you cannot use them because and we get some money and we want to make beautiful gardens, so I have a community meeting. You must build walls, and so those bad people cannot come in. I said, build walls against those people. And who are those people? All those people dealing with drugs and whatever and so forth, and we need to keep away. And I say, well, if they come in, they steal our tools, we lose a shovel, we lose spades, or sometimes one time we got wiped out, or we lose flowers. But you don't build walls to keep things away. And in a community, you have to embrace the dark element, like a big man. You embrace him, and he transforms and sends out ripple effect that affect hundreds of people coming in, that drug user, and find an anchor in the shore, and to struggle to restore their life. And so that's how you restore. You gain trust. Every step of the way you have to measure where I am, how am I true to the project, and am I being respectful to the people we are, and embrace the darkness, and that will transform the beast into beauty. Thank you.
Right.
Thank you.
Nathan?
I was going to make just a pragmatic point in response to Richie's discussion about fear, which is we have to be very thoughtful about conflict of interest, right? When we look at sort of news media, basically they're selling airtime and they're out there trying to capture minds, and they will take advantage of our brain mechanisms that respond in a fear-like way to things. And I do think there's this very interesting concept which is percolating, which I think for this crowd might be very interesting, and the concept is risk literacy. The notion is we need to have training, probably for kids in high school that basically helps them to sort through and really determine what's an important risk and what's not an important risk. It's basic probability and things like this, but we are going to be, we'll constantly be exposed to these sorts of things, and it doesn't mean there aren't real risks, but we need to give people the tools to sort of sort through what are the real risks and what are the sort of false risks, and be able to assess them so they can watch these media and be afraid when they need to be and responsive when they need to be, but not be afraid constantly, because it's like we're going to see murders every day on those televisions if you watch it, and there'll be a disaster somewhere in the world that now there's going to be a phone that's going to capture it, and it'll be triggering our brain mechanisms to basically say, whoa, this is fearful, because our brains did not evolve in a setting where we could see every disaster that occurred everywhere in the world at the same time. And it's a big thing that we're going to need to address and tackle. George Church, who's a really amazing biologist at Harvard who does a lot of work in different areas, has actually proposed replacing calculus in high school with something like risk literacy, basic sort of probability to help people think through statistics and have the kind of tools where they can say, you know what, that doesn't make sense. That's not a real risk. That one really is a risk.
I realize we're almost at the break, but I do want to acknowledge that there's perhaps a question.
There's one
over
question
here.
over there, yeah.
Yes.
I was pleased that Margaret raised the issue of testing, and she talked about how many teachers feel that their profession has been taken away from them by the testing movement. And I know that Derek also touched on this, but I wonder if there could be a slightly more sustained response to this, because I think it's a really important issue. I was in Chicksum High's session this morning, and he mentioned that the organizational paradigm for modern public schools is probably the whole factory system that existed after World War II. And I was thinking of that paradigm, and I was thinking how, if that is the paradigm, what we're going through now is like a work speed up, that teachers must be feeling this and students must be feeling that. I noticed in the State Journal today that Madison is failing. Probably some of you saw that. I think it's such an important issue, and I think it works against what most of you have been talking about for the last 2 days. The testing movement as it exists works against curiosity, creativity, etc. So I just wondered if I could get a more sustained response about that.
Well, since I was fingered in this what I was talking about this morning, and I really believe it, is that testing for school learning, what you learn in school, is not really the point if you want to measure what education accomplishes. What you have to measure is what the kid does on its own outside of school. And until we have a good measure of that, I think all we are doing is kind of assessing either inborn talent or memorization of information that doesn't translate too well into real life. We have to find ways of finding out what kids actually do when they're on their own outside of school. That's the measure of whether they have learned something from school. It's what they do outside. And unfortunately, that's hard to measure. And we end up doing what Drunk did when he lost his key trying to get home. And he looks under where the street light is because it's better light there, even though he lost the key somewhere else. we have a good light about measuring test scores. That's a good light, but it's not what we really need. And that will take a joint, long-term dedication to find a better way of measuring what education is about.
If I can just comment briefly, there's increasing evidence to suggest that emotional intelligence is a much better predictor of life success than academic performance. And so I think that our efforts to measure limited domains of cognitive and academic skills are misguided with respect to the outcomes in which we're all most interested. But I also share Mihai's comment that to measure these other qualities in a really careful, rigorous way is a major project, and that project is not yet completed. In fact, I think it's just begun.
So the other dimension to testing is that I would assume from what you just said about Madison, that Madison is characterized as having a lot of less privileged children in the schools, because there is a direct, absolute correlation between poverty and test scores. And we have split into, as we're doing in everything in this nation, into a class society. The achievement scores of children from the middle class are fine. The problem is with schools where economically poor children are located. So it's really, and the work of Jonathan Kozel in this regard, who's one of our great educators since the 60s. I can't remember the book that he wrote about 3 years ago, but it was about how after all the work with equality, affirmative action, the percentage of change in the performance of poor students, it was like 0.1%. There's been no impact for all these years. And that's really the issue in education. I mean, yes, we're also creating generations of middle-class students who are super achievement oriented and ultra competitive and completely stressed out. But they're not the ones who are failing. Our school systems are failing the poor, the economically poor. And we just need to notice that, because I think that's very important.
Thank you.